thinking. So please join me in welcoming Stelarc. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So the ideas that I'll be presenting are essentially ideas that have been generated from these projects and performances. For me now, the biological body has always been in excess, augmented, amplified, probed, electronically sliced, prosthetically extended, and the strategy that has always been used is to accept this with a posture of indifference. And by indifference I mean being open to possibilities, not having expectations which quickly collapse into actualities. So how can you suspend that process of expectation? And to me, it's by acting with indifference. The suspension performances were performances that were never meant to generate any meaning. These were experiences that were about affect. The stretched skin is a kind of gravitational landscape in these performances. Between 1973 and 1975, I made 3 films of the inside of my body. I filmed 3 meters of internal space. This was not for any medical reason, but rather that experience of probing the internal tracts and spaces of the body. So the body is not this bounded biological form, but rather an architecture of empty spaces, circulatory tracts, and tissue structures. This performance began when the body was switched on and ended when the body was switched off. The sounds that you heard were amplified brain waves, heartbeat, blood flow and muscle signals, and these were either physiologically controlled to generate a different composition of sound, or they resulted simply from fatigue. So in this increasingly video, virtual and vicarious world, the body tries to assert its materiality. So the body here is not seen as a site for the psyche nor for social inscription, but rather a site that needs to be sculpted, not as an object of desire, but rather an object that should be redesigned. And this is a body that is interactively operating in a flattened ontology of machines, microbes, objects and algorithms. I'm alluding to object-oriented ontology, which I'll mention more later on. The third hand was the first augmentation of the body. This was sophisticated enough at the time to be invited to the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena and the Johnson Space Center in Houston to demo the third hand to the extravehicular activity group. It's actuated by electrodes on the leg and abdominal muscles, so it's possible to individually control the hand by controlling the signal contraction of each particular muscle. Initially, the hand was effectively a visual attachment to the body, an attachment that was used in performance, but nothing else. Except I did also learn to write with my 3 hands Here, each hand is writing a separate letter at the same time. I had to keep my two eyes on what my three hands were doing. And because each letter was a different complexity, you had to control the speed of your writing for each individual letter. So you would finish each letter at the same time. And because of the spacing of the three hands, I had to remember which letter I was writing, because I had to remember every third letter. And because this happened on a sheet of glass between the artist and the audience, I had to learn to write this back to front. Only learned to write two words, evolution and decadence, because these were both 9-letter words. So these following manipulators go beyond biomimicking the human hand. The extended arm is an 11 degree of freedom attachment, which extends my arm to primate proportions, makes my arm a very long arm, results in an additional joint to my arm. And what's interesting about this arm is that as well as wrist rotation, thumb rotation, and individual finger flexion, each finger splits open. So each finger becomes a possible gripper in itself. This performance was a 4-hour performance, continuous performance, where whilst my right arm was extended with this 11 degree freedom manipulator, my left arm was involuntarily moving 15 to 50 volts of electricity contracting the muscles. So my left arm was pre-programmed for 4 hours whilst my right arm was performing with its own agency. The sounds were not internal body signals, but rather sounds generated from sensors on the limbs. So it was the choreography of the limbs and the pneumatic sounds, mechanical sounds of the extended arm that produced that sound cacophony. I'm, by the way, not showing these projects and performances in time, but rather presenting them more logically, because this performance happened in 1995, 5 years earlier than the one I just showed. But it has to do with the idea that once we had originally determined that you could program your arm to move involuntarily, this might be possible remotely. So this is the muscle signal control box, the 3D model. By touching the 3D model, you generate a movement on that 3D model, and a second later in Luxembourg, where my body was, my body moves involuntarily. So people in the Pompidou Centre in Paris, the Media Lab in Helsinki, the Doors of Perception conference in Amsterdam, for example, were able to remotely access, remotely activate my body. A split body experience, voltage in, involuntary movements, voltage out, controlling a third hand. The ambidextrous arm, imagine an arm that is double jointed. Imagine a hand whose fingers can bend one way and the thumb can rotate, and you've got a right hand, but they can also bend completely the other way. The thumb can rotate backwards, so you've got a left hand and a right hand all in the one sort of universal design. It's human-like, but it's a double jointed hand. I initiated this at Brunel University when I was had a research position there, and we were just testing the double jointed finger movements. The project has progressed much further than this, but we could precisely control the double jointedness, and also this arm was actuated by pneumatic rubber muscles, making it a much more flexible and compliant arm. An actuated orthosis, which was designed with a PhD student. It's a 3D printed orthosis, so it's 3D printed all in one overnight. You attach linear actuators, and all of a sudden you can animate a paralyzed hand, or use this as a controller for a remote robot arm. For me now, bodies have become end effectors for other bodies in other places and for machines elsewhere. This results in interactive loops and recursive choreographies online, everywhere, at all times, which we sometimes as individuals log into. Effectively, our heads are electronically amputated, our hands are rewired, we become these online chimeras which proliferate as a kind of virtual flesh distributed. Bodies become portals for people in other places. As well as manipulators, I've always been interested in locomotion, insect and animal-like locomotion. In 1997, with the help of F-18 in Hamburg, we designed a six-legged walking robot. What's interesting about this is that the arm gestures select the leg movements. The robot can walk forwards with a ripple gait, sideways with a tripod gait. The robot can also sit, it can stand, and it can turn on the spot. This performance was simply taking a robot for a walk. Nothing else happened. You just determined in which direction you improvised and selected the walking movements. This was the first performance that was more dangerous for the audience than for the artist, and the first performance I did dressed. Initially, I got on the robot naked, but the robot was hitting the concrete so hard that the vibrations and the shock through my legs was too great to bear. I mean, it looks very smooth on video. It was not. It's a very crude and powerful robot. And so the only way I could get on the robot was to wear shockproof boots. And then I thought it prudent to wear some clothing as well. A six-legged walking machine. Exoskeleton was 3 meters in diameter. This robot is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meters in diameter. It would fill this whole room, and this robot, or this walking machine I should say, functioned with encoders on my hip and leg joints. So when I lifted one leg up, 3 robot legs lifted and swung forward. By stepping up and down on the spot, the robot moves. It was always stable because 3 legs were always on the ground. So here you're translating human bipedal gait into a 6-legged insect-like locomotion. Another project, only 2 meters in diameter, also a 6-legged walking pneumatically actuated machine with a human head displayed. The idea here was to construct an actual virtual interface where the mechanical movements of the legs modulated the facial behavior of the head. The rotating ultrasound sensor determines if someone is standing in front of the robot. If it detects you, it stands, selects from its library of possible movements, and then performs a little choreography. robot sits down, goes to sleep, and waits for the next person to be detected. Another six-legged, more insect-like robot, a little webcam mounted to the back of its body. This has never been fully realised yet, but it's an animation that indicates what's happening to construct a small robot that would be robust enough to climb up my tongue and into my mouth. I just have to be careful not to swallow. A gesture towards the increasing intimacy of our machines, our robots, with the human body. One might predict that in the future all technology will be invisible because it'll be inside your body. Nanoscaled, these miniature sensors, miniature robots will provide a much better alert warning system of any pathological changes in chemistry, temperature, or blockages in your circulatory system, or problems with clusters of cancerous cells. So if you don't know about actor network theory and object-oriented ontology, I would highly recommend you read up on them, because I think these, with the Internet of Things, are very important ideas in terms of our relationship to machines and technology in general. Bruno Latour's actor network theory and Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, they're both flattened ontologies. They don't preface the human. The algorithm, the object, all of these are seen equal in terms of their interactive relationship. The difference is that with Bruno Latour, the emphasis is that any actor, and the actor can be human or non-human, any actor, their qualities, their capabilities are due to their relationships in the network. Whereas with Graham Harman, there's a focus more on objects, and by object, he doesn't necessarily mean a physical material object. Rather, an object is defined as not being able to be defined by reducing it to its component parts or evaluating it from its effects. So neither reduced to its parts nor evaluated from its effects. And of course, with the Internet of Things, what we're really meaning here is that objects are being embedded with circuitry. This enables communication of objects. Objects become smarter. Hopefully, humans become smarter as part of that relationship. In 1993, I decided to make a sculpture for the inside of my body. This was because of the theme of the sculpture Triennale was site-specific works. But instead of a sculpture for a public space, I decided to design a sculpture for an internal body space. This was inserted with the help of a friendly endoscopist. Fully opened, it was about the size of my fist. So when you imagine after it was inserted inside, down the esophagus and inside the stomach was inflated with air to make it safer to be in there. The sculpture opens and closes, extends and retracts, has a flashing light and a beeping sound. So the body here becomes not a site for the psyche, but simply a site for a sculpture. So the body now, for me, is this contemporary chimera of meat, metal, and code, of modified biology accelerated by metal with a speed that far exceeds its metabolic, muscular, and sensory capabilities. And it's also a chimera extended in cognition with code. So in this collision with technology, skin sticks to screens The faces that we interact with are flattened. Technology initially culls, appropriates and contains the human as its image. The human appears as an apparition within this technological construct. In 2005, in collaboration with another artist, Nina Sellers, we both underwent liposuction to extract 4.6 litres of our biomaterial. This was inserted in an installation titled Blender. Blender is the sort of inverse of the stomach sculpture. Instead of a technological object inside a soft organ of the body, here a machine becomes the host for a liquid body, a soft body composed of biomaterial from the two artists' bodies. Anthropomorphic in size, and this was last shown at the MCA 11 years after it was initially shown in Melbourne. The ear was originally imaged as an ear on the side of my head. This proved to be an anatomically dumb sight to have an extra ear because you have so many facial nerves coming out from this area that to construct an ear here might lead to a partial face paralysis. So this was a problem. But in 2006, with the help of 3 surgeons from the United States and with funding from a London production company, we inserted this scaffold beneath the skin of the forearm. The skin is then suctioned over the scaffold, and over a period of about 6 months you have tissue ingrowth and vascularization occurring. So the ear becomes fully integrated. It's still only a relief of an ear. If you can, the lighting is a bit tricky, but I think you can all make it out. And during this second surgical procedure, we also inserted a small microphone in the ear construct, because the idea here is that it's not just a matter of replicating, relocating the ear, but rather also in the future rewiring it to electronically augment it to internet enable the ear. So the ear is not an ear for this body, but rather an ear for people elsewhere, a listening device. Even though my hand is wrapped in bandages, it has a partial plaster cast, the surgeon speaks to the arm, the ear, his voice is picked up and wirelessly transmitted. So it's plausible, but the problems abound. And it still has not been electronically augmented, although I'm working with a grinder group in the US to see if that's a possibility within the next year or two. But you know, this project began in 1996 as an idea. It took over 10 years to find 3 surgeons, and it's over 10 years again since the last surgery. But there was a surgical procedure a few weeks ago. The stitches have just come out, which you might have noticed. This led to some sculptural installations. This is a 4-metre long sculpture of representing the ear on the arm. A performance at the Lawn Sculpture Triennale where I simply lay on the sculpture. My body was covered with white slip, with white clay. It was very cold. My body was very, very warm. The clay cracks. This is really about a counterpoint between a whole physical body with an ear on its arm and a much larger fragment of the body, which is the sculpture. Whilst I was lying on there, though, I thought it would be more interesting to suspend my body above the sculpture instead of just simply lying on it. We inserted 16 hooks into my back and legs. Everything was rigged up, and when it was ready, the body was hoisted up. So this performance began when the body is lifted up.
Go, Cameron, go. Go.
I knew from previous performances that when the cable takes the full weight of the body, because the cable is braided, it untwists and it spins the body around. I thought I would spin perhaps for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, it went for about 15 minutes because the body would spin in one direction, pick up speed, slow down, and then spin in the other direction. This performance began when the body was hoisted up and ended when the body was lowered down. A performance where the body was attached to the end of an industrial robot arm. Now, in this particular performance, the body's trajectory, choreography, and position orientation was pre-programmed. It's interesting because I've prepared 2 alternate presentations, and I think I'm showing the wrong one, but we'll manage. So we're in this time of circulating flesh where, for example, we can extract organs from one body and insert them into other bodies, where we can take the hand from a cadaver, attach it to an amputee, and animate that cadaver hand. It's also a time of fractal flesh, where bodies and bits of body spatially separated but electronically connected generate recurring patterns of interactivity at varying scales. And this is just a description of the internet. And it's also a time of phantom flesh, where not only are we functioning increasingly as virtual bodies, but because we're oscillating between these physical and phantom representations, we create a haptic thickness, which makes it eventually indistinguishable between what's physical and what's not. So what's interesting here too is, to others online, the body appears flickering on and off as kind of digital noise, as a glitch in biological time. We can now create instant hyperreal skins of any face. And we can animate these skins. And at an audio-visual level, it's going to be difficult to distinguish between whether it's an actual person at the other end or whether it's an animated skin. In fact, now, that this, what I would call the age of the thickening, not only of optical thickening as images become digital objects, but also of a haptic thickening, which is the result of this oscillation between the physical and the phantom. Our phantoms proliferate to the point now too where they become more like phantom limbs. These experiences are not simply image-based anymore, but have a kind of a tactile force feedback possibility about them. So here we come again. So coupled and complicit with machines, the body's task envelope is expanded both spatially and operationally. The sound of this performance is very important. There are different motors on this 6th degree of freedom industrial robot arm, and as each particular motion occurs, the sound changes. After the performance with the body is replaced by an ear the size of my body, and exactly the same choreography is produced. This is the simulated model where we were able to program all the movements, and what's interesting here is that the robot that choreographs the ear is the same robot that carved the ear. So the robot is effectively a 6th degree CNC machine that carves the ear. What the robot in the design and architecture building is doing now. So for me, there was always a ghost in the machine, not as a vital force that animates, but rather as a fading attestation of the human. Stickman is a full but minimal body exoskeleton. And in this performance, which was for 5 hours continuously, my body is algorithmically actuated for the whole duration of the performance. But the mini Stickman there enables the audience to interact and insert their own choreography. So by moving the limbs of the mini Stickman, pressing play, the background algorithm becomes inserted with the choreography from the audience. The sound that you hear is sound from sensors on the exoskeleton, the pneumatic sounds and mechanical sounds of the Stickman. In 2016 at the Perth Institute of Contemporary Art, we connected Perth, New York and London, where for 5 days, 6 hours every day, I could only see with the eyes of someone in London, I could only hear with the ears of someone in New York, but anyone, anywhere, could access my right arm using the exoskeleton to remotely activate. So it was a kind of outsourcing of my senses to people in other places and sharing my agency. The video clip that I'm going to show is a more recent iteration, only for 4 days, 5 hours every day, connecting 3 different cities in Europe, so live streaming.
Gewichtsweise morgen insbesondere im Süden der Neigungssäule bei 15 bis 18 Grad. Am Mikrofon. Zwei verschiedene Sparten jetzt. Vielleicht zum Schluss noch für mich noch Frage, mich wundern nimmt, ich weiß nicht, Redi sagt.
Ganz best, ja.
Es ist 1:1.
1:1.
Am Morgen sie durch die Sendung geschoben.
Dann Livestreaming tun. Don't speak, I know just what you're saying. Ganz viele verschiedene Sachen, die ich cool finde.
So in this sort of age of mixed realities, the body performs beyond the boundaries of its skin and beyond the local space that it inhabits. The body's extruded into these non-places of virtuality, also sometimes navigating nanoscales, but extending its sense of self. But this extruded body experiences itself as empty, not an emptiness from any lack, but rather an emptiness through excess and extrusion. If we can 3D print with living cells, which we can, but if we can print complex organs of the body, if we can stem cell grow organs, then this will mean an excess of organs awaiting bodies, of organs without bodies. And in 2011, the first twin turbine heart was inserted into the chest of a terminally ill patient. He only lived for a few days, but they fully tested this twin turbine heart. More robust, reliable and smaller than any normal artificial heart before. But what's interesting is that it circulates the blood continuously without pulsing. So in the near future you might rest your head on your loved one's chest. They're warm to the touch, they're speaking, they're sighing, they're certainly alive, they have no heartbeat. I'll finish with that, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Or many questions?
Oh yeah, good question. Thanks, Stelarc. Great to hear about your work again. I was just thinking about what you've done over the history of your career in the context of the current rise of AI, which seems to be very disembodied. I just wondered what you thought about, like if you look at the sort of latest state-of-the-art AI and deep learning, and it sort of references the neurons of the brain that doesn't work in any way like that, but also operates at a level that works globally through the data collection that happens, and seems to just completely subjugate the whole idea of the reality of having a body.
Yes.
Do you think this is just a phase we're going through, or is it something that represents a sort of major turn in the way that people conceptualize intelligence?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because in a sense we've come full circle, whereas in the 60s artificial intelligence was essentially seen as something that was possible algorithmically, computationally, but then we didn't have the computer power to do that, and also there was a realization that perhaps intelligence needed to be embodied in some way. So then you had little robots, simple little robots, with a few proximity sensor, a heat sensor, a position orientation sensor. You let those robots into the real world, which was much more complex than any virtual state that you could generate at the time, and you watched how obstacle avoidance, how emergent behaviours could be generated. So there was a feeling then, I think, that intelligence wasn't simply a matter of algorithms and computational power, but had to do with bodies interacting with the world. And of course, whether it's an insect body or a human body, we function, we manipulate, we sense in different ways. And that's what's interesting. I think the most fascinating possibility is to explore the possibility of not only teaching neural networks from statistical information, but rather seeing if in some way we can generate alien kinds of thinking that become increasingly divorced from our biological interaction with the world. So can we disconnect artificial intelligence from human programmers and truly generate an alien intelligence? I once said foolishly and in my more youthful period of writing that the first signs of an alien intelligence may well come from this planet.
That's still probably true.
So yeah, no, it's an interesting question to explore really. But now we have much more powerful computational systems, more micro-miniaturized. We can put them on board robots, whereas before they were often tethered to large computer mainframes. Now we can control robots with grown chips that can be taught obstacle avoidance, for example, just by chance, by learning in that way. There's a do you guys know the work of Mark Sagar, the University of Auckland? I think it's on this. I didn't think I had time to show it, but I'm just going to show it because it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's baby X, and this is, she's been learning to read words. So here's her first word book. So let's see what she can see. It's in her page. And here we go, let's see what what's this, baby? What's this? What's this? What's this? Good girl. Now see if she knows what the word is. Okay, baby, look over here. Okay, what's this? What's this? Good girl. Nice try.
I won't show the whole video, but effectively, with this high fidelity 3D modeling, enough morph targets to generate appropriate facial behavior, facial expressions. This combination of cognitive sciences and neurophysiology, you can create sort of curiosity behavior that's shown here, and you can effectively teach this artificial bot as you would teach a baby, and they're teaching ASIMO in the same way by making simple associations. You show the robot an apple, the robot sees it's round, the robot sees it's red, it distinguishes that the next day from an orange, which is a different colour, for example. So it's really a fascinating period in time when we're discovering and applying sort of human learning with much vaster data streams and statistical information to feed them. On the other hand, though, I think what would be really interesting would be to generate an alien intelligence.
Can I ask you some questions? I was very impressed, first time I saw your work when I did my PhD. And the first question I have is, if the body is dismantled and connecting to everything, and what really mean about the human?
Well, I think the human construct has always been an unstable one. I mean, historically, what it means to be human changes, and if you take the Heideggerian approach, each person is kind of thrown into the world at a particular moment in time with particular technologies at hand, which is actually refuted by object-oriented ontology. What it means to be human is going to be something that's going to be different historically and whatever technologies we have at hand. I mean, now we can electronically slice the human body without harming it, without it being dead. What's interesting now is that we can indefinitely preserve a dead body with plastination whilst sustaining a comatose body indefinitely on a life support system, whilst cryogenically preserved bodies await reanimation at some imagined future, and we're engineering synthetic life in the lab. So this is the first, I guess, the first time in our history as humans that we're living in proximity to dead bodies, to artificially engineered bodies, to synthetically and genetically remixed entities that are kept alive in the lab. So what generates aliveness, is in question now. It's no longer only through biology. It's through code, through machines, and so on.
And also, when you talk about your work, somehow I feel like that you have very interest in the Buddhism kind of philosophy as well. So because the Buddhism is connecting the human body is being connected everything, and when we're going back to we become the empty, but that empty is not actually empty itself. It's more like it includes everything. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I did live in Japan for 19 years, but having said that, I've never been in any way religious or even spiritual. So often people see the suspension events as either, physical kind of actions of human prowess or yogic kinds of control or shamanistic displays, and then none of those things. The body is just seen as a sculpture in its materiality, embedded in this 1G gravitational field. And in these ideas of indifference and emptiness, yes, the words point to these other previous philosophies or ideas, but that's, I think, only a surface connection that I'm referring to a completely different way of looking at it. When I say indifference, I mean as opposed to expectation, to prevent everything collapsing into actuality. What's interesting about art is the slippage that occurs between what's intended and the outcome. And if that collapses too quickly, then the idea is simply illustrated by the object. Nothing interesting happens in between. Nothing accidental occurs. So that's what I mean by being indifferent in terms of performing or in terms of making art.
Can I ask one thing? I'm thinking of time. All of this is making me think, believe it or not, about art history. And I'm thinking about where you see your work, I guess, kind of being perpetuated in some way within that kind of art historical structure. So, like, I'm thinking of how all of your performances, you're integral in many ways to the performance itself. But, have you factored in ideas for, how you want the work to be remembered retrospectively, how you want the work to be kind of preserved or conserved?
It's not that old, come on.
But I'm saying, you're talking about distributing agency. Yeah. You're talking, you're bringing, in a sense, all these kind of factors in, and in a sense, you're still kind of central in the performances, at least.
But I think there's always.
How does the work kind of? How do you factor the work in that sort of? How do you consider where artistic agency kind of ends, or when the work can be kind of experienced by others? I've seen like a Marina Abramovich retrospective where obviously she wasn't performing a number of those kind of works, but in a sense other people did. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, but it obviously is a consideration that an artist, especially a performing artist, makes.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting exhibition, partly because what do you do when you have a retrospective of a performance artist, and do you just show photographs and videos? But if you want to try to capture the physical presence, the endurance, the other qualities of an actual performance, and the artist can no longer perform it or can't perform all of those, is it adequate to have others, in a sense, recreating that performance? And I think most of those recreations didn't, the outcomes weren't successful. But it's a dilemma with any performance artist, and you're also outside of the art economy because museums and galleries are invested in collecting objects, whether they're sculptural objects, installations, or pictorial, stuff. So it's a problem. It's difficult. I mean, in the way that I've reconciled some of these problems is that in recent performances especially, well, by recent, the last 15 years or so, often when I've constructed a say, an interactive performance, when the body leaves, after the body has performed for 1 day or 5 days, for the rest of the month or for the next 3 months of the exhibition, the installation is still interactive. So for example, Stickman could still be interacted with, and it actually looked better without the artist in it, because it really was a Stickman. So that's what's kind of happened. The trace of the body is still there in a way, but is replaced by the interactivity of the installation itself. But it's a dilemma.
Yeah.
It's a dilemma for artists.
Take one more question.
I'm a bit worried about asking this question because I'm fearful that I've missed some of the kind of philosophical nuance that underpins it.
Probably the opposite.
But I'm curious about, so some of your work looks at you being able to control kind of additional limbs, but then a lot of your work also looks at you giving away control of your body. But it feels to me as though you haven't explored as much the opportunity to kind of share that control. So to, interleave you wanting to do things with what the crowd is trying to get your limb to do, for example. And so I wonder whether you can just reflect on that and what that might look like, and if that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, that is an interest to problematize what we simplistically imagine the body is as a free agent and as being able to choose. In all of these performances, in fact, there's a splitting of agency. So partly the body is performing involuntarily, partly it's inserting its own agency. So in Stickman, for example, it's a 6th degree of freedom actuation, but it means one leg is free. I need one leg to balance on. But I use that leg not only to balance, but to pivot. Okay. So I'm introducing or contributing to the choreography, but also to relieve the fatigue of only being in one spot. And with the muscle stimulation, again, it was a split body experience. Now that was, in a sense, by design, because it wasn't easy to kind of interweave the two, if you know what I mean. But I always imagined another kind of performance where, for example, you and I might be connected remotely. You might be in Melbourne, I might be in New York. Half of your body is actuated by my right side. Your other side, is controlled by my left side. So in effect, we share a half of each other's body, and generate a kind of interactive collaboration of gestures or performing artistic tasks. I use the word gesture because all of these projects and performances are artistic gestures. We shouldn't at all, and this is what I dislike about the word research being used in the arts, because often this is an institutional attempt to authenticate artistic practice by calling it research. In other words, making art is not sufficient in itself. It has to have some kind of scientific component. Now, this is coming from someone who's always used technology.
And been at university.
Don't dig me deeper. But, it is this sort of suspicion about why institutions want to, explore artistic practice as research. That's the dilemma that I face. And also risk aversion. You have to get ethical approval. None of these projects would have happened if I had to get ethical approval, or most of them wouldn't. So I've tried to kind of just bypass or benignly ignore, those aspects, and hence I don't usually last long in institutions. When they discover after a few years that I haven't complied. Should I say that?
I think we should put it live.
Oh, hang on. No. Damn my job application.
I think we've run out of time, but please join me in thanking Stelarc. Thank you so much. And hopefully Stelarc can hang around for a couple of minutes if he's got more questions that he doesn't want.